At Disciple Science, we are eager to talk about the resonance and compatibility of science and Christianity. You're probably aware that not all of us have heard that message, and for many, this relationship has been a source of conflict and tension. Today on the podcast, we feature a friend who is working to reach those who have decided they don't want to be associated with Christianity, the exvangelicals and the nuns and the duns. John Kirkwood is a pastor who started an organization called the Sparrows Call and a YouTube interview show called Voices in the Wilderness to create a space to explore Christianity and science outside of the confines of a traditional church. I think you'll find a lot to learn from John's wisdom and insight, so please enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with John Kirkwood. All right, we are fortunate today to be joined by John Kirkwood. After 20 years of ministry, John and his wife, Wendy, left a pulpit in the Chicagoland area to answer a call to ministry to the disaffected, those who are unlikely to ever enter a church setting. The Sparrows Call is an outreach to what pollsters have come to call the nuns, the duns, and the searchers. Its goal is to remove the unnecessary obstacles that both hurt and hinder belief and help turn doubt into wonder. John is the co-host with Christine Johnson of Voices in the Wilderness, an interview show that promotes resources and ministries at the intersection of faith and science. And John is husband to Wendy Kirkwood and father to Connor, Carter, and Peyton, and they all live in Gilbert, Arizona. John, so glad you could join us today. Thanks for being here.
Wonderful to be here, Dale.
Yeah, so fill in the details there on your bio. I'm curious to hear about your ministry and what type of church you're in, and also just what called you away from that, aside from maybe the Chicago winters.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it short. Chicago winters, yeah. So what called me away from it? Well, it was kind of multiple causation, but I had pastored there for quite a long time, for about 15 years. My father, who was a pastor before me, used to joke, you wear out your welcome after about 6 years at a church. That wasn't the case at our church. It was like a family, small, non-denominational church. Yep. And believe it or not, though, I was going through some changes, and it relates to a number of things, but one of them was probably, believe it or not, he's in the news again, but probably Donald Trump.
Wow.
So my church was an older church, very conservative, and I, to confess to you, Dale, I was kind of early on a culture warrior pastor. And I got to a point where I was troubled by that, where I saw that it was almost kind of an idolatry had crept in,
Wow.
that you're seeing kind of now with the Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
And, I wrote a political column years ago. And then when Donald Trump came on the scene, I was surprised how many kind of went after him, and I don't want to make this political or turn off any of your listeners, but yeah.
I was going to say it's that whole political side to Christianity can't be separated from the growth of the nuns, right? There are lots of other factors, but that gets cited so often, how unappealing it is, how unaffirming it is of Christianity to have this unnatural wedding. And it's not about the Republican Party, just any politics. It just so unhealthy. So
it is, and it took. And once I realized how unattractive I had become, I wanted to change. And I've always been a big fan of C.S. Lewis, and so. I poured myself into Lewis a little bit more and George MacDonald's unspoken sermons. And I realized that, I kind of came to the conclusion that he had something going there with Mere Christianity, because here's somebody who's beloved by Catholic and Orthodox and all kinds of Christians respect him and so forth. And I got to a point where I was tired of so much unnecessary division. And so I started, studying Lewis and so forth. But at the time, about 5 years ago, I was, it was pointed out to me, this phenomenon of people leaving the church, as you mentioned, the nuns. And I grew interested in that, and I started to study it. And I probably, looked over, there were something like 89 different surveys and polls.
Yeah.
And usually the top 5 reasons for nuns and duns are, there's like 10 reasons that show up in these surveys. And so it's kind of like the best of 5 rock and roll bands. There's the Beatles and the Stones and Zeppelin. They're going to be in there somewhere,
Right.
maybe in a different order, and Elvis, whatever. But these reasons kept coming up. And so as I'm studying this, and I'm reading, hundreds of deconversion testimonies, it weighed on my heart. And so I started, this is about 3 years ago, I started an evangelism apologetics class just to talk about those issues. And of course, with disciple science, that one of those main issues is science. So science, politics, the relationship of the church with political groups, not being able to express doubt was another big one.
Yeah.
They didn't feel that they could ask questions without being judged as, of having little faith or being a troublemaker or something like that. And so I started looking into these issues, and my life changed because of it, Dale, for 2 reasons. One, I started to listen to them, right? And 2, I started to listen to my fellow pastors. I was in a number of pastors groups, and when I bring up this subject, most of the time I was kind of disappointed or horrified at the response. And the response was some variation of, well, they were never of us. If they left the church, they're not of us. They were never of us. And even though that passage is talking about false teachers, it just reminded me of the story of the prodigal, right? And the little brothers in the far country, and the older brother's still doing his thing, thinking, going about his business, but he's standing on the wrong corner in Luke 15. He's Jesus is attracting sinners to him. And my father said years ago, he said, if you're not being accused of the same things as Jesus and Paul, you're probably doing ministry wrong. Right. And so I started to weigh my ministry by that. And, that passage says that the sinners were coming to hear Jesus. And, the Pharisees were standing on the opposite corner judging him. And, the story of the prodigal is kind of a gentle rebuke for the Pharisees there. And he's kind of saying, you're the elder brother in the field. And I said to myself, well, what should that elder brother have done? And to me, the answer is to go into the far country after his little brother, and let him know he's got a seat at the Father's table. And I think this is what Jesus is trying to say in that story. And all of the stories of Jesus is trying to get our attention, that the good shepherd who goes after the lost sheep, the good Samaritan, where you have the priest and the Levite doing their church business, but ignoring the felt need that's right there on the side of the road.
Yep.
And so I'd talked about it with Wendy for a long time. She knew this was heavy on my heart. I didn't think that I was getting any more traction with my ministry at my church because they had hired a different guy. They had hired a different pastor, and I was disappointing people because the last 3 years of my ministry was focused simply on the love of Christ. And so, which I'm not saying they didn't respond to that, but it was just a sea change in the pulpit. And I felt a little guilty about remaining there because I had changed. I spent 3 years seeing if I could bring them along, and to little or no success. And Wendy knew I was passionate about my little brother in the far country. And so we talked about it, and we decided to make the change.
Yeah, that's neat. And so how do you go after people that maybe don't want to be gone after? That's a kind of an awkward way to say that, but a lot of these people that have either left the church or don't want to hear from it in the first place, how do you reach that audience?
I love that question. Well, I got to tell you who I've been inspired by. I mentioned C.S. Lewis and George MacDonald, but there's a guy who's living right now who next to Jesus Christ, I think is the greatest example of evangelism ever. And I'm not even sure if he's a Christian.
Hmm.
Having said that, but his name is Daryl Davis, and
Right.
I know you're a musician yourself. He's a jazz piano player, jazz and blues.
Yep.
And Daryl has this unique hobby. He happens to be Black. He was born in Chicago, my hometown, but he lives in Baltimore now. And Daryl, in his off time, goes to Ku Klux Klan meetings.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yep.
So Daryl, I mean, if one Black man led one racist out of the Klan, that could be, you know, a great book or even a wonderful documentary or movie. Daryl has led 200 people out of the Klan.
Oh, yeah.
Some about 24 of them were high-ranking Klansmen,
Yeah.
Grand Kleagles and so forth. And so when I studied Daryl, he basically treats them as human beings, and he listens to them, and he shows them interest and love.
Yep.
And now, having said that, it's not a success story in the fact that he's not King Midas. I mean, for those 200 he's led out, there have been thousands who've spit in his face,
Sure.
called him the N-word, and probably threatened him.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know what the percentages are, but I thought to myself, you know, I can learn from Daryl, right? And so at the time I was still involved in the culture wars, and I was on boards for the pro-life ministries and family ministries. And I said, we need to bring Daryl in and listen to him in, kind of a TED Talk type thing, because this is what we want to do, right? We want to approach our adversaries and make them friends. As Abraham Lincoln said, when I've taken my enemy and making him my friend, I have destroyed my enemy, right? And there wasn't a lot of interest in bringing Daryl in. And I think I said this to my wife, I said, part of the problem with being a culture warrior, and I'm saying this about myself, is you have an Old Testament mentality, right? I mean, we just saw the Jericho March in Washington. Now, if you think that out, the Jericho March was a war, right? I mean, they marched around a city that they wanted to take over. The walls fell down, and they killed everybody but one person. And this is modern Christians doing this around their neighbors and their fellow Americans. And so whenever you hear a culture warrior, and I saw this in myself, we're fond of quoting the Old Testament prophets, right? We want to slay the, prophets of Baal. Jesus doesn't want us to be Elijah, right? He has a different message for us. And so, no, we need to get down on our knees with the basin of water and the cloth and wash their feet. And so that approach wasn't real popular. And so, so that was part of my transition out of that. And so Daryl Davis, if you haven't heard of him, folks, there is a documentary made about him, and he's a fascinating fellow to listen to, and really a master class in how to not only listen, but how to become somebody who has an intimate relationship with somebody that you would probably normally find despicable. And so I've never seen the love of Christ better presented in a manner. Like I said, I don't even know if Daryl's a Christian. He doesn't talk about his faith much, but I've never seen it presented better than I have in other than Teresa of Calcutta and Father Malachi, other than Daryl Davis.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I love that. I mean, there's something to be said for churches. Clearly, once we decide to follow Jesus, there's the discipling process is ongoing, but a ministry that's just rooted in your local church and in your local community it's got restricted walls perhaps, and reaching out to those people that aren't interested in going to church, it's a whole different story. And so, more power to you. I think that's great.
Yeah, that's a real key to realize. A lot of people, when they see people leave the church, their mindset is, how do we get them back in the church? I don't care about that, because I finally got to the place where I realized, wait a minute, you look at the early church and you find out that the church is an organism. It's not, most of the time you ask somebody about church, they tell you a where and a when. I go here
Yeah.
at this time.
Right.
And the church is not aware in a when, it's a who.
Right.
And when you realize that no, you could take church to them. And the early church really centered not around a building and programs and, the kind of thing we've made it today, but it's centered around a dinner table.
Yeah.
And I think I think COVID's given us an opportunity
Yeah.
to make that real again.
Yep.
So especially there's some people who will never step foot in church. And,
Yep.
We talked about the nuns, but the nuns kind of walk by the church and they're indifferent. The harder group is the duns, because the duns have tasted and walked away. They've rejected
Yep.
Christ and Christianity and the church. And so I don't mean to speak blasphemous here, but to talk in kind of a business accommodation. Getting back a disgruntled customer is much harder than reaching a new customer.
Yeah.
And
Right.
I don't mean to say that that's what the gospel is or evangelism is, but I'm just saying a nun walks by the church and is indifferent. A dun slams the screen door on his way out.
Yep.
And so that's a different approach to a dun than a nun. And then there's searchers who are spiritually inclined, but they don't know where to begin, because maybe they've grown up in a secular home, or they've grown up in a broken home, and they don't have any experience of church life or Christianity or any religion. And yet they have that yearning that Pascal and Lewis and Augustine told us about, that yearning for a relationship, that God-shaped vacuum in every human heart.
Yep.
And they're seeking, and so those groups are what we're kind of centering on.
Right. Now, I mean, this is a complex, but yeah, I mean, you talk a lot about science, especially in your Voices in the Wilderness program, and that's, I think, looped in and tied in with the Enlightenment and this pattern, which is real, but probably we make too much of it of education, right? The more educated you are, especially in the sciences, it seems that the less likely we are to pursue a religious faith. What's behind that pattern? I don't know. I mean, do you think that there's something real there about thinking our way away from God, or is that the wrong approach?
Boy, you're probably better equipped to answer this than me. But I would say that, when you work in scientific fields and you're dealing with natural questions and natural evidence,
Yep.
And then you kind of, that's your world, and if you don't have a background in faith, you don't really see a need to introduce the supernatural. Or you're studying physics, you don't really have a place for metaphysics.
Yep.
So I think that might be one answer. It might be multiple to others, but part of it, and part of the reason that science is important for us, is because we're here in the United States, and in the West, we've made such a botch of the intersection of science and faith,
right,
that it's big. Now, if we were in the UK, maybe the Sparrows Call would be shaped differently, because this isn't a need in a lot of places in the world right now. But here in America, if you look at the data, there's heavy percentages that believe, that God created with special creation in the last 10,000 years. And so there's all this baggage that comes with being a Christian in America, whether you have an evangelical background or fundamentalist and so forth. And so we're seeing a lot of kids here. That's one of the reasons they're leaving the faith, because they just don't find it, not that it's not probable or not even possible, they don't even find it plausible.
Yeah, right. Yep.
I mean, they get to a point where they go to college and they take one course. And see, I know young earth creationists and other creationists, I should say creation scientists, like to make the big boogeyman Darwin and evolution. But actually, it goes much beyond biology. I mean, if you take a course in geology or paleontology or archaeology, or, if you're looking at plate tectonics, I mean, to embrace that world, creation science, you have to reject nearly all of modern science. It's not just biology. And in doing so, you have to embrace the mindset that is susceptible to conspiracy theory, because you have to think that scientists are either lying or they're under some kind of satanic spell.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
Or
then you
willingly
get
deceptive. Yeah.
or willingly
Yeah, I suppose
deceptive.
it counts as lying, but yeah.
And so one of the reasons that we love disciple science, that we love biologos, that we try our ministry in the science end, which is Voices in the Wilderness, is trying to introduce our community to voices they might have not known even exist.
Right.
Because so many of them see it as a binary. You either believe God in the Bible or you're a godless atheist. And that binary is really strong. And that's what really crushes, that's what shipwrecks so many people's faith. And you see it with a lot of the YouTube atheists. But in other words, atheism isn't the greatest creator of atheists. Toxic Christianity is.
Yeah.
And so part of our ministry is trying to say, no, it's not. You have another option other than those two options.
Right.
And it's tough because people within our own community make it hard, right? Because there's some of the loudest voices in the room. Now, I've noticed this even in your demeanor, Dale. I'm not a scientist. I don't have a background in science. I am a member of ASA, but I'm under the theology kind of, they let a few of us theologians creep in. So it's under that. But I do notice it's the demeanor of most scientists is not going to be an in your face kind of thing, you know? And so part of their world is they don't necessarily, and there are exceptions, you're one of them, but they don't necessarily have any training in communicating to lay people what they learn. And so it puts you at a disadvantage in some cases with some of the louder voices in the room.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I hadn't thought about that, but probably the most highly esteemed scientists are the ones who are doing nothing but research. You know, they're very little interaction with undergraduate students or teaching or communicating. That's a distraction from writing grants and publishing papers, and so we probably lose our ability to empathize with the questions that come from an 18-year-old kid. You know, and that gets at a topic that I think we both struggle with, which is the way we do apologetics today. You know, and I think that so much of those scientific atheists are they're pushing back against what they think Christianity is, because their understanding of it is through the lens of young Earth creationists, which are, you know, again, as we've said, so vocal. How do you think we need to revise our approach to apologetics?
Ooh, great question. I mentioned Lewis. I think the big mistake we make in apologetics is, and you brought up enlightenment thinking. I think we're trying to please, that corner of the room. And so we've gotten to be all about facts and reason and arguments. I think that's a huge mistake. We've lost sight of the story. It was Tolkien, right? Tolkien and witnessing to C.S. Lewis, who brought up the power of myth and the true myth. And I think, you know, what was it that he said to Lewis about there's no tale ever told that men would rather find was true. And if you think about that, and you think about how the lost think about the gospel now, that's not true.
Yeah,
right. They're offended by the gospel, or they think it's stupid or silly. But when Tolkien said it, I think it was true. And now if you think about it, Lewis, it was that argument. It wasn't the Kalam cosmological argument that convinced Lewis, right?
Right.
And so I think we've lost sight of the idea of mystery and the idea that look, there's Christian apologists who think you can prove God, and so they
Right.
fail
Yeah.
philosophically before they even get out of the gate.
Yeah.
And so I am really disappointed with the direction of apologetics. That part of it, Dale, is I think Christianity, especially here in the West, is so consumed with certainty
Mm-hmm.
that we have left no room.
Yep.
There's no air left in the room for mystery, and certainly not for faith, right?
Yep.
So I think we've gotten away from the idea of story. Holly Ordway, she's a Catholic who teaches at Houston Baptist University. She was an atheist, but she was teaching Tolkien and Lewis as an English professor. And she said it was those years teaching Tolkien and Lewis that opened her mind to even consider Christian arguments in apologetics.
Wow. Yeah.
But, all of apologetics is built on one verse, and be ready to give every man an answer.
Yeah.
And I like that because it says an answer, not all the answers, right?
Right.
And it's for the hope that is within you. Now, I certainly hope that is within us isn't the fine-tuning argument or the teleological argument. Those things are all important in the place, but the hope that is within me is Jesus Christ. And I think we're almost embarrassed to bring that kind of argument up because we do live in such an enlightenment heavy period, and we think we have to prove it scientifically, and that I think is a big mistake. And I'll be honest with you, Dale, if you consider the apologists that are out there right now, I don't see a lot of people, and this is I'm probably gonna get beat up for this, but I see them preaching to the choir. I see the people that are following them are kind of like fanboys, and the people, and I don't see like a Daryl Davis reaction. I don't see a lot of atheists coming through their ministry to Christ. I see a lot of people just confirming their bias, and really some of the younger apologists I really like because they don't have a problem with evolution.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But when you see some of their demeanor online, they're very combative with atheists. I think that's a huge mistake. It makes it an us and them thing.
Yep.
And it's unnecessary. I actually think atheists should be listened to, and I think more often than they're not, they're right. Because let me just say this, and this is going to be controversial. 5 of the biggest objections to Christianity. I wrote a column on this, the 10 objections to Christianity. But the top 5 objections to Christianity are going to really get people mad, and luckily they won't be able to throw a rock through my computer. But they're God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, the Bible, and Christians. Now, having said that, slow down, folks, and don't kill me.
Yeah, right.
When I say God the Father, it's a misrepresentation of God, right? The ugly God, the cruel God, the angry God, the God who wants to burn the vast majority of people in hell, as kindling wood. The same thing Jesus said, or Paul said in Galatians, you preach another and different Jesus, which isn't Jesus. So a lot of what the atheists fight against, I don't agree with either. It's a caricature of the Godhead. And then, the Bible can be used or misused. But one of the biggest things that I see the nuns and the duns underlining is Christian hypocrisy, Christian judgmentalism. And they've had experiences with it, or they're watching how the bishops handle the priest scandal, or they're watching how Hollywood basically ends the careers of people in the Me Too movement, but the church hides it and fights for it and doesn't admit it and doesn't come clean. And so they're weighing the church, and we're found lacking. You can't see the bridegroom when the bride is so schizophrenic, and what they're seeing is this schizophrenic bride, and it's ugly, it's fat in that dress, and it's just not appealing. We've lost the true, the good, and the beautiful. Tolkien was appealing to Lewis on the true, the good, and beautiful, and I think at least in the West we've been distracted. And so that's what I think apologetics is missing. We need to recover the beauty of that story again that made Tolkien say, this is the story that every man wants to be true. And who wouldn't want it to be true if you don't know that you have a loving father?
Right.
And so I think that's where I'm saying it's going a little bit. Let me give you one example about the ugliness of God. I mean, if you look at the great atheists and their arguments, Christopher Hitchens, for example, in the modern Four Horsemen, they're not arguing against the God I worship. They're arguing against the God that is preached in corners of Christianity, though.
Yep.
And when Anthony Flew, right, the great atheist, who followed Lewis at that Oxford Socratic club and made that famous argument in the 50s, probably the most famous atheist of the 20th century, when he became a theist and he wrote that book, There Is No God, and he crossed the no out.
Mm-hmm.
People assumed he was a Christian. And he was asked before he died, why haven't you trusted Christ? And because he said it was his work, it was science that led him to believe that there must be a creator, right? But why haven't you made that next step that Lewis and others made and trusted Christ? And he gave two reasons. He said the doctrine of eternal conscious torment, and he said, and he mentioned Romans 9, but he gave the kind of Calvinist interpretation of Romans 9. So these two obstacles kept him from trusting Christ. Now, he spent the last month of his life with N.T. Wright, who doesn't hold either of those views. So we don't know how that worked out. I imagine it probably worked out pretty good. But there are views that Christians present, including young earth creation, that are so just absurd or abhorrent that it... Well, look, the God of the Old Testament said to Israel, the Gentiles curse my name because of you. Yeah. And so I think that wasn't just true of that generation. I think in every generation, people take the Lord's name in vain. We've all been wrong at some point. We've all presented a wrong version of God and of Christ and possibly of the Bible. And I think I pray oftentimes for forgiveness for being a part of that. But I mean, we're all capable of it because we're all fallible.
Yeah. But it's so interesting that the whole invitation of Christians to let go of our certainties and our proofs and our conviction, our desire to lay an answer before people's feet that is undeniable. So difficult to let go of that. I think even I hesitate to engage in certain conversations because I don't have an answer that can't be dismissed, right? It's you and I exchanged something on this once before. I think that's why we have let go of seeking God in creation, because it's too vague, it's too subtle, right? And it doesn't fit in with our modern approach to apologetics. But I think that's the same approach that Lewis and Tolkien had, and I was just listening to a talk a few days ago about whether the Lord of the Rings was an allegory or not, and like this desire to say, well, then who's Jesus and who's Satan and where does it fit in, and just perfect clarity, I think is so difficult to let go of. So I'm kind of rambling now, but I guess my question for you is, what opportunity does rediscovering what I think the origins of natural theology hold, which is just exploring nature, creation, not looking for proofs of God, but looking for some sort of connection with the transcendent? Is that something that is accessible in this sort of post-Enlightenment Western world?
Ooh. Yeah, Scripture talks about the hardening of the heart, right?
Yeah.
I think over a period of time, some people are almost, and I wouldn't give up on anyone, but some people have have become so hardened that it would be hard to reach them. But I think if they are going to be reached, it's through that awe that you're
Yes, right.
talking about.
Yep.
That awe will either be found in, in nature or in relationship. And my mother used to say, love is the only key that can open the closed door.
Yep.
And I when all else fails, I can't remember the atheist who said this, but there was an atheist who was asked what was the best argument for God. And he said, well, it's not the Bible. I have an argument to refute anything you bring up, but I guess the best argument for God would be the life of my mother.
Wow.
And I think with some people like that man, that's the only thing that could melt that heart. And that might be the opening, or it might be, listen, with Anthony Flew, it was that awe that he saw,
Yep.
that he couldn't escape
Yep.
in his work,
Yep.
and he said, he thought to himself that the math just isn't quite there for this to be completely natural. And it might have been years of trying to stifle that feeling, that yearning,
Yep.
right, for belonging that's within each of us. And I think that is key. Now for you and I to stand aside somebody who's not there yet, I think that's something that we can keep in mind too, that it's usually not going to be a good argument that's going to win that person.
Right. Yeah. Right. And yet that's all what we default to, right? It's that I've got to somehow argue them or use science or philosophy to convince them that God has to be true and hope that their heart will follow, instead of perhaps going the opposite direction. Right? Let's show them.
And you mentioned the path of apologetics, and you see apologists going to college campuses and people line up 20 deep and they ask good questions or sometimes leading questions, but it's like batting practice. And I don't think apologetics should be batting practice where you swing at every ball because you put in the 50 cents. I think sometimes we should say, I don't know.
Yeah.
Sometimes we should say, that's a great question, and I'm still wrestling with that.
Yeah.
Because it's true.
Right.
But Christians feel like they have to have an answer. And so, a lot of times I'll have young believers say, where can I get a book that will answer some of these questions? And, Norm Geisler and others have written books like 200 answers to hard questions. And the last thing you want to do as a young believer is plug your umbilical cord into another man's thinking. I mean, Paul talked about doing your own spade work and not hiring out or outsourcing your own study.
Yep.
And so I usually don't recommend any of those books. I think those books oftentimes are an obstacle to actual real wisdom.
Yeah. What do you recommend? I think if you're reaching out to these folks that are anxious about Christianity or hesitant, but maybe you've sparked some curiosity, where do you point them?
Well, it depends, I think, on the conversation we're having and maybe what they've unpacked for me personally. Yeah. But if you're asking me just bland and in general, I still think that possibly the finest apologetics book, if you want me to choose one book, is Mere Christianity, is Lewis's Mere Christianity. And I know, we have a mutual friend in Francis Collins. I know that was instrumental in his life. And there's a book out there, and I can't remember the author. She's wonderful, but she wrote a book called Mere Christians. And that book is, each chapter is a different person that has been led to the Lord by reading Mere Christianity. And so when I look at the greatest apologist or evangelist of last century, it's Lewis. I really think Lewis one time said, reason can lead us to the truth, but imagination leads us to understanding.
Right.
And so I think those two, if you want to put them, those two have to go together. They're truth and understanding. If you want truth and understanding, we can't leave out the imagination. And if you look at the life of Jesus, some 70% of his ministry was parables or storytelling.
Right.
You know, it wasn't systematic theology. I mean, there's one part where he reads from Isaiah in a synagogue and
Yep.
and he exegetes it. But but most of the time he's telling a story. And I think we need to get back to that.
Yep. But and
unfortunately, this is going to sound bad because his reputation is in disrepute right now with the sex scandal. But somebody who handled that pretty well was Ravi Zacharias, where if you looked at Ravi's ministry, and I'm not trying to excuse the behavior that he's on, but if you look at his ministry, he would use a three-tier approach to appealing to somebody, and he'd give theory, but he'd also break it down with kitchen table talk, and then give an illustration. And I think we've gotten away from that, and we're just about reason, and we're about whack-a-mole. Somebody asks us a question, we got an answer to that. What's next? And sometimes it's real. I don't think that's very persuasive at all. I just don't think it's winning people. And if you look at the combat on the internet, it's the whole idea of a debate. That we're going to debate the atheist.
I was just about to go there. I think the prevalence of debate as a pathway, like we point people to a debate. Watch this theologian take down this atheist as a reason for why they should be Christian. It just doesn't sit right with me, and I don't think it's effective more than anything.
And if you look, Dale, at what is appealing to the younger generation, the nuns and the duns, it's the intellectual dark web. It's seeing Jordan Peterson sit down with Sam Harris and dialogue, not debate. It's seeing Joe Rogan interview somebody that maybe he agrees with or he doesn't agree with.
Right.
It's watching a TED talk, that's informative. But the young Christian apologists, it's all about debate and who pwned who. And, that's how YouTube is set up. And watch William Lane Craig embarrass this guy.
Yep.
And I'm not picking on Bill. I'm just, he's just the most well-known, and it's. I don't think it's a. I think Bill's ministry is necessary, but I think a lot of the young apologists who think they need to be the next William Lane Craig and stuff like that. I think we need to. I keep bringing up Lewis, but Lewis was one time given a compliment by an older woman, and she said to him, "We need more good Christian authors like you." And he corrected her. He said, "No, we need more good authors who happen to be Christian and who bring." Lewis's idea was to bring in the Christian story, but under the radar. He used the expression to sneak past the watchful dragons.
Yeah.
Right? So some people have this built up wall, and they don't want to listen to a sermon, and they don't want to be preached at, but they would read the Narnia Chronicles not knowing that they're getting a sermon, or they'd read Lord of the Rings not knowing that it was fundamentally a Catholic work. And that's an art. And so I think apologetics has forgive me, I'm not insulting you, but
no.
There is art and there's science, and apologetics is too much of a science now, and it's lost its art form.
Agreed.
And so there's that.
Well, that's something that we're working to do. Part of my plan with Disciple Science is to talk about science, but also clarify that science has got some serious limitations, and that if you want to be a Christian, science can enhance your faith, but your faith can enhance your science as well, right? And that there's this beauty to faith and this mystery, and the Cartesian instinct to break things down and pull them apart and think that what lays before you on the table will then reassemble into something even more is I think wrong-handed. And so I adore science. It is my career, but the deeper I get into it, the more I realize that proof is not, as you said, it's not relationship. It doesn't affect my heart. And that's where I'm deeply interested in rediscovering natural theology with what you said, imagination, right? Not using science as proof. And I'm not interested in rehashing the arguments for God from creation. I'm much more interested in connecting with God through creation. And I wonder, what role does seminary play in that? You know, and I know seminary for you was probably a few years back, but what's the message that emerging pastors are getting about how to reach out to people, and is there opportunity there?
Yeah, boy, I'd be struggling to answer that for you.
Yeah.
But I would say, based on the American pulpit, I'd say seminaries aren't quite getting it. And I will say this: there's a defensiveness in Christianity when it. Here's something I'll say that will actually be a compliment to you. Christianity should be theology, which is supposed to be the queen of the sciences, could really do with a lesson in the scientific method, and that is that we shouldn't try and hide from the truth. Let the data take us to where we need to go. And I think a lot of Christianity, when you think about it, is fear and loathing. And especially on the seminary level, and when you have creeds and confessions. Now, in Christine and I, in Voices in the Wilderness, we talk to a lot of professors.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them work at Christian universities, and some of them work at secular universities. And the freedom of those who work at a secular university, they don't have this document they have to sign every year to live under, and that to me is not great. I don't think that's good. I don't think that's really open to the truth when you have to sign a confession. In Chicago, there was a controversy at Moody at their school.
Yep.
And it was a financial controversy. But a local journalist, a gatekeeper, I'd call her, of Christianity, decided to take the opportunity to attack two professors because she saw in their social media that they weren't enamored with the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy, right? So she tried to get them fired, even though they had nothing to do with the financial difficulties at the head of a Moody Bible Institute. And I thought, this is just kind of an absurd, kind of a scary thing, I think, for most professors to have to live under that. And I think it carries on into the pulpit and into the church. And I'm thinking of a young man who works for Biologos, and he went back to his father's church after university. And he found out that his best friend from that church, they both went into the sciences, and they came back, and he came back and he found out his friend had become an atheist. And he called his friend and he said, "What happened? We followed the same path. How did you end up where you're at?" And he said, "I found out that in science, asking questions is encouraged."
Wow. Yeah.
But in church, I was either a heretic, or I lacked faith, or I was a troublemaker.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when it comes to the pursuit of truth, when it comes to the pursuit of truth, he felt the church was an obstacle to that. And that breaks my heart,
Right. Yep.
And so I don't know if I answered your question about seminary, but I've talked to a lot of pastors. They get one semester usually of critical scholarship on the New Testament or whatever. And most pastors don't know how the Bible came together, but they've signed something about inerrancy. And so we've kind of, Bart Ehrman has a career because he's told the truth about some of the texts. And we tried to keep it hidden behind kind of a Wizard of Oz, like he pulled back the drape on the Wizard of Oz and said, "Well, wait a minute. No, we've been arguing about this for 500 years. It's well known." But in Christian circles, we've kept it secret that, John 8 might not be in the text at the beginning of of John 8 or something like that. And it's unnecessary. It was unnecessary, and it created when we try and help out God, I'd say this, Dale, if you look at the story of Ishmael, when we try and help out God, we open a Pandora's box, right? God doesn't need that help. Let the lion out of the cage. The truth can defend itself. We don't need to treat it like a house cat. So no, I think there's a lot we can learn about how to do church better and how to do seminary better. But I don't think I can answer that question well for you.
No, that's okay. It's just a curiosity. I've encountered some people that have talked about the emerging progressiveness of seminaries, and there are these programs that are taking science into seminaries and helping people process that. Because I hear so often about pastors that say, I don't feel prepared to talk about these topics because I'm not a scientist, right? I'm not a scientist, and so I'm just not going to talk about them. And I think from the average person with their butt in a pew, if their pastor won't talk about it or doesn't feel comfortable talking about it, then they're just not going to hear about it, and they just kind of go along with the social norms that there must just be conflict because they're not talking about it. So
when it comes to that, I think I'm seminary and pastors are oftentimes led down that path. They're taught how to put bodies in pews and how to organize the church. And on the other end, if you go to some seminaries, it's all about systematic theology and organizing everything in a neat little box. And if you go to Southern, you get this this brand of
which box you
and
get.
If you go to Southeastern, you get this brand. But I'm kind of with George MacDonald on that. MacDonald had a disdain for theologians. He said, and I don't mean we interview theologians, so John Walton, we love you, but he said theologians have done more to obscure the gospel than her atheist adversaries. And I think there's a truth to that. When the world looks in and sees that we're at each other's throats because you believe in sprinkling for baptism and we believe in full immersion, or you would dunk a baby and we think you can dunk an adult. And when you see blood that's shed over that, or you see people fired over that, the world looking in on that's going to think that's just crazy.
Right. And it is, right?
Yeah.
Isn't it? Yeah. We need to learn how to discern what matters and what doesn't, and get comfortable with disagreeing with each other. That's a message that I harp my students on, right? That we are going to disagree with each other. Let's learn how to do it well. And I think that's where, as we discussed, our desire for certainty and the use of apologetics as a mallet, it just doesn't fit together with that approach. That let's be in relationship and dialogue as opposed to.
Well, I hate to argue with the scientist about science, but I'm going to take a swing, and that's because you said something earlier that I would like to at least give a sideway issue to. And you said, well, there's things that science can't address, and that's true. That's true. But as somebody who looks at science and theology, and I had an apologetics page, Dale. And I once did an informal survey on the page. It was filled with people who ran Christian schools, fellow pastors, people who worked in, full-time Christian service. Right. And I asked a question, and the question was, when did the breach in relationship between science and the church begin? Was it over astronomy with Galileo, or was it over evolution with Darwin? Mm-hmm. These are educated people. They were intelligent people. 73% of them said Darwin, which was 300 years later. Now, I love the video that you've done on this issue on Galileo. And here's a place, right, where if you look at the theologians over this issue, and you and I have talked about the two books analogy, right? That God wrote the world and he wrote the word, right? He spoke them both. So all truth is God's truth, whether it's in a chapter and a verse, or it's in a telescope or a microscope.
Yep.
It's all God's truth. And if you look back at the Galileo period, Copernicus, Galileo, even Kepler, you're seeing that the theologians read both books wrong, right?
Right. Yeah.
They
Yeah.
got the science and the theology wrong. And
Right.
and I was just reading Luther the other day, and Luther was making an argument for, the water above the firmament.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And he basically said, I don't care what they say. This is what the Bible says. And it could have been Ken Ham saying that. I mean, it was like that. I've heard Ken Ham say this, and I've
Yep.
heard Jason Lyle say, I start my astronomy with the Bible.
Yep.
Whereas a fellow believer, Mary Schweitzer, says, when I look in my microscope, I don't bring my faith with me. I look at the data and I report on it. That doesn't mean I don't have faith. It just means it doesn't have a place in this aspect of it. So if you think about that scenario, and I know you kind of bring it out in your video, but it wasn't theologians that fixed that.
Right. Yeah.
They dug their feet in, and it was a couple hundred years of embarrassment where we became an obstacle really to our Christian witness, because we were embracing something that the world had already moved on from and accepted. And, for a couple hundred years, and now maybe we're in a couple 100-year thing with creation science, with Darwin.
Yep.
I don't know, but it's good to reflect back on that, because it's humbling, and it should be humbling to us to realize maybe I'm reading the Bible wrong, or maybe the Bible really wasn't addressing what I'm thinking it's addressing here. Mm-hmm. And why can't I learn from a scientist who's looking at the book of nature? Maybe he's getting that right.
Right.
And so I just think that there are times where the scientific method and science actually can be better to us than seminary.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or our Christian traditions.
Yeah. I agree. I argued that position in a different video, talking about, Kuhn's model of resistance to change that we see in science. I think that applies to theology as well, right? That we won't change our theology until we're forced to, basically, until the evidence becomes overwhelming. I don't know if that's a terrible thing, but with the Galileo story, I'm not surprised that people didn't see that as the start of science. I don't think we talk about it. I didn't encounter that story until I was 30 years old. I think in part because it doesn't reflect well on the church. I mean, you're right. We got the Bible wrong. We got the science wrong. We were, kind of jerks about it at times. We just didn't do anything right there. And so that's where, I don't know that it's going to make its way into a Sunday morning sermon, but couldn't we learn from that a huge amount? But because we come out with a black eye, let's just not talk about it instead.
It actually did make it into a Sunday morning sermon. Before I left my church, I taught on that as and not the whole sermon. Right. But I brought it up as an aspect of humility. And two people approached me afterwards to disagree with me, and they came up to me the next week and they were shocked because they went to prove me wrong and Googled it
and found out. Yeah.
And they found out and they were shocked. They were shocked. And so this goes to something about what you were saying about we don't hear about it. We don't hear about it.
Yeah. And so I think that science has kind of made the church look bad a couple of times, maybe more than a couple of times. And when we go to science, if we're not looking to prove God, which I don't think we can do with science, if we just want to have an encounter with God, it's too subtle to lead people through, in a mysterious way. And there's the fear mongering out there that it's going to lead you to some sort of new age version of Christianity. So from my perspective, it seems like we just don't talk about it.
Yeah.
And I'm delighted to hear examples of exceptions to that. People say, "Oh no, my pastor's invites us out to go worship in the woods or whatever." That's great, but it seems to be unusual. At least maybe I'm just in two fundamentalist circles in my neighborhood. But
yeah,
it seems that there's genuine fear around exposing people to searching for God, where the answers they get are going to be imprecise, that you're going to have to use your imagination to find God there. And instead of seeing that as a wonderful opportunity, we're fearful about the outcomes. So it's something that I'm so delighted to hear you talking about the approach you mentioned of Daryl Davis, and you don't have to talk about the name of Jesus or cite chapter and verse in order to have a relationship that will convert somebody's life. And I wrestled with that myself with disciple science, how explicitly Christian we want to be. But I think that there's opportunity there to invite Christians to use their imagination, seek God through poetic means and the study of creation and outside of the Bible, and see what they find. And I think that we would make great headway in using that actually as a gateway into this discussion of science and faith. Sorry, I'm monologuing here. I'm supposed to be asking you questions.
No, that was beautiful. I agree. Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate your heart, John, for these people that I think you and I are in similar ways targeting an audience that has lost hold of what is such a beautiful, thing, which is this desire to follow Jesus for reasons that are sometimes, just it's no fault of their own. Their perception of Christianity is not the reality. And so I'm grateful for your ministry and you're reaching out and addressing some of these questions of science and faith that we're trying to deal with as well. So I really appreciate you coming on. Hope that we can talk about this again at some point in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me. And we hope to have you on again soon.
Yeah.
It was a great show, and may God continue to bless disciple science. You're doing a great job, and we share it. And that's one of the reasons we had you on, because we want people to know about you as a resource. And, you talk with students, and just it's so heartbreaking when they don't really know
right
that there's another option. So I'm grateful that we live in a time where biologos exists, where disciple science exists, where there's places, authors and talks on the web where we can share with people. Because it really is a terrifying experience to feel that you don't have a home anymore,
right
or that you're a man without a country.
So before I let you go, what's next for the Sparrows Call and for Voices in the Wilderness? What are you working on?
Ooh, we're going to start a podcast soon, kind of like you, because we've gotten a lot of interviews, and a lot of people can't watch on YouTube, so they've been wanting to follow online. So we're going to be starting a podcast, and depending on how this year works out, I don't know if there's going to be a conference at some point, but we hope to do that in the future. Maybe put together a conference where we invite voices like yours to come and speak, or where we go and get a table at the BioLogos annual conference or something like that. But right now, that's what we're going to work on. We've got more interviews lined up with some interesting people, and a podcast, and we'll see where it takes us.
Great. Well, it's the Sparrows Call.
I should mention one other thing, and that's I do a live stream on Sunday mornings for people who don't have a church home or don't feel comfortable in church. It's called Church Without Walls, and you can find it on my Facebook page, or we put it up on YouTube under Sparrows Call. So we welcome all those who come in peace, including our atheist brothers or agnostic brothers. It's just to explore the idea of God. So
great.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, John. It's great.
Thank you.
Great talking with you. We'll talk again soon.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Disciple Science podcast. At Disciple Science, we believe that integrating science and Christian faith can inspire a fuller knowledge of God. We produce this podcast and our videos to help you connect with God through God's creation. We are a crowd-funded nonprofit based in St. Paul, Minnesota. If you want to support us, you can give by visiting our website at disciplescience.com. We hope you'll subscribe on YouTube and Instagram and Facebook so you can stay in touch with everything that we're doing. We want to thank Caleb Davis for producing this episode and for composing our theme music. I'm Dale. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk again soon.